Risto, when I look at your work, it's very fascinating, and I've been waiting to have someone who's an expert in artificial intelligence to chat to, and you are one of the best in the world. I mean, you're the perfect person for this job that I have, this quest to understand the mind. So first of all, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Now, you know that the basis of this podcast is to try and conquer the mind-body problem. How is it possible that a biological system becomes this psychological mind? And I think artificial intelligence forms a very huge basis of the cognitive sciences at this point. I mean, you guys are at the forefront of what's possible in terms of future minds. Now, with that being said, I want to start with a very deep question. What do you think about AI and possible future minds in terms of teleology? I mean, from human minds to artificial minds, do you think this is possibly the next step when it comes to the evolution of minds?
Well, it's probably a future step. It's not a step that we can take right away. But currently, I see the role of AI and artificial approaches to constructing intelligent systems as a way to understand them. I mean, you can have theories that are philosophical and hand-wavy about what you see in neuroscience, for instance, or human behavior. But only if you actually build a computational system that step by step reconstructs some of those behaviors, you can look at that artificial system and see how it actually came out. And that gives you an understanding in a much more concrete sense than you can otherwise. And even if you're doing recordings, perhaps in neuroscience or something that gives you data points, you still have to connect those data points. And that's what these computational systems give. And that's the role that we see now. That's very productive now. Now, whether sometime in the future, these mechanisms that allow you to understand actually become minds themselves, that's a much bigger question. There are multiple breakthroughs that would have to happen. And then we have to have a definition of what it means to be in an equal level of a mind and metrics that demonstrate that. And we don't have those just yet. But I can certainly see that it is a possible future. Not necessarily clear what the steps are towards it, but it's something that could happen in the future, yes.
If you had to speculate, how far do you think we are from that? How close do you think we are?
Well, several breakthroughs, like I said, are necessary, and we don't even know from those breakthroughs what the next ones might be that are necessary. So this is still not within reach. It's not something that will happen in the next few years. It might not even happen in our generation, which is a little disappointing in some sense. I'd like to think that it happens and I will see it. I will live to see it. But realistically, when you don't know what you're still missing, it's hard to put a time bound on it. But we definitely will see a lot of progress, and we may see artificial systems that already are useful, that act as companions, as something that makes us more powerful. Say just driving, automatic driving, personal assistants, robots maybe at home that do some physical things like fold your laundry or load the dishwasher, or the dishwasher itself that's intelligent and understands what to do. So gradually these artificial systems will take on tasks that we are doing now and make our life easier. And that we will see in our lifetime now, and hopefully, in a next decade or so, we can start to draft some of these definitions of what it would be for somebody to be an independent mind.
Growing up, were you ever fascinated by that thought? Were there any, for example, TV shows, books that really captured your attention when you were younger and just stirred the pot for you and led you to this career path in AI? Anything particular that you can recall?
Yeah, of course. I mean, a lot of people who work in artificial intelligence were totally inspired by science fiction. I mean, you're fascinated by it, and then you want to contribute to it. It of course turns out to be a lot harder than any of these science fiction things make it look. But data from Star Trek, for instance, that's a good model of something that you would like to build. And part of it is that data has this fascination with humanity, and he's constantly questioning whether he can be human and what is lacking, like the emotions and there's this mysterious emotional chip that can be added, and then it doesn't work. So it's actually data, and his quest is at the core of trying to build artificial intelligence. Of course, there are many other science fiction characters and concerns, as well as problems that are solved. HAL from 2001 Space Odyssey, a little bit dated maybe as a concept, because it was built as a rule-based system that had an inconsistency in it, and we know that doesn't quite work. And modern AI is not really based on those principles. It's based on statistics, correlations, and that kind of approach that would not get into that kind of a mode. So, but on the other hand, we understand a lot more about schizophrenia and paranoia as neurological diseases, to the point that we are now starting to build models of patients that are artificial patients and are tested and evaluated as such. So in that sense, I think that's another motivation that kind of in an indirect way, certainly driving my research.
I think I'm very fascinated by what you just said, because I write a couple of essays on consciousness and schizophrenia. So just tell me more about some of these models you're talking about regarding these schizophrenic pseudo patients, in a sense.
Yeah. Yes. We had a long collaboration with Ralph Hoffman at Yale, a psychiatrist who actually sees patients and treats them, or used to do it. And he identified that there was a model that we built early on in the 80s, actually, that could be extended to the level of schizophrenia and analysis schizophrenia. A model called Discern that reads stories and paraphrases them and answers questions about them. And that's how you actually understand schizophrenia and diagnose schizophrenia. You sit down with the patient and talk with them and have them tell stories, and you understand that their stories are not normal. They diverge into different plot lines, and you can't keep the characters straight. And there are certain hallmarks of schizophrenia that you identify in these stories. So his idea was that we will take Discern and disable it in different ways and see which ones of those pathologies then result in schizophrenia-like symptoms. And this worked out really well. I mean, it took quite a while to do that, to extend the model and also collect the data from schizophrenic patients so that we could characterize in patients what this kind of behavior looks like, so that we could then recognize it in the model. And Uli Grossman did a lot of this work. And we did discover that some pathologies are more likely to result in schizophrenic symptoms. In particular, connection death was one of those. And then we also discovered that in the model itself, if you change some parameters we did not really think of ahead of time, we were trying to come up with a treatment, and found that if you try to treat it too hard, you yank up the learning rate, it actually becomes more schizophrenic. And we stumbled upon a new hypothesis, which is actually consistent with dopamine hypothesis and aberrant salience hypothesis of schizophrenia, that there are periods when you cannot tell what's salient, and you learn too much, your learning runs amok, and then you can, from a brief period, you can get a lifelong schizophrenic disorder that way. And that came from the computational model, and Ralph was testing it then on fMRI and other patient interviews, and found that there was some evidence for it. And that is a really interesting example, because it shows you that you can use an artificial patient to gain an insight that you probably would not have otherwise had. And therefore, then, of course, you have to go to the patients and verify that, which is the work going on now. But the insight came from a computational model.
That's really intriguing. I mean, because one of my questions was going to be, what would you say are some of the practical implications of AI within medicine? But you've already touched on that. So that's any other really intriguing studies that you guys have done in terms of the medicine and AI?
Yeah, we actually have a different model, and a different topic. Bilingual aphasia, patients who had a stroke and they lost ability to name objects and speak, I guess, also in different languages to a different extent. And again, Uli Grossman is working on that, and it's a collaboration with Boston University with Swati Kiran's team. And we have that approach, those models, in a clinical trial right now. It's, as far as we know, it's the first time that an artificial patient and a mechanism based on it is put into a clinical trial as a potential treatment. So what we do is build a model of each individual patient separately, based on their language history, based on what we know about their pathology and based on what we know about their performance after the stroke. And then we can fit the model so that it's actually a model of that particular patient. And then we can test different treatments. In this early clinical study, we are looking at how to balance the training in English versus training in Spanish. Patients are shown pictures, they have to name them, and this way they get trained one language or the other. And it turns out that if you train in the right language, you have recovery in both languages. But if you pick the language wrongly, in some cases, you only recover in the language that you treated. And it's a complicated pattern of what you know and what your history is that matters. And that's what the models allow you to tell. Offline, we test the model in these two treatments and pick the one that's better, supposed to be better. And then we applied the patient. Of course, it's a clinical trial, so it's double blind and all that, and we don't have the results yet. But the hope is that by picking the language, treatment language, this way, using a computational model, we get faster recovery and more complete recovery.
Okay. Well, I'm very impressed by that. I mean, a lot of the times when doctors consider a lot of the technological advancements, they often feel this, I wouldn't say solipsistic mindset, but they always feel irreplaceable, that a lot of their studies has to be done by them, by these human beings. But it's intriguing to know that sometimes you can just sit back and let a computer program do a lot of the research for you. I mean, that's quite intriguing. When you also work in the cognitive science field, what would you say is the relationship between AI and the human mind and trying to understand this mind-body problem? As you know, we're trying to figure out the mind-body solution here. When it comes to AI, what do you think its implications are with regards to understanding our own minds?
Well, a lot of the AI is motivated by human behavior, but it's not all there is in AI. I mean, if you're building these systems, for instance, deep learning models of speech recognition or visual recognition, the goal is simply just to do better and even do better than humans. It doesn't matter whether it's human-like or not. I mean, there are some motivations, deep layered structure in the visual cortex, for instance, but that's long gone. I mean, now that we have hundreds of thousands of layers, that's no longer really biological, because the goal is to just do well, and it is useful to do well, and that's no longer really a cognitive science study. So in that sense, I think the field has diverged, and maybe it's always been separated. There are those people who work in AI who simply want to do well in a task and build robots, perhaps, that would be helpful. And then those who use these computational techniques to understand what makes humans work. And those models can be quite different. So for instance, this model I just mentioned, the bilingual aphasia, we only have access to maybe 40, 50 patients. And the data set is always going to be limited. In deep learning, you need 100 million examples in order to really take advantage of the latest deep learning models. So we're never going to have that if we want to fit to human behavior. That's at least not right now. I mean, maybe eventually everybody is going to be connected and you can collect from the whole humankind. But right now, the data sets are always going to be limited, and you are looking at a particular pathology. So that's narrowing it down even further. So you have to build models that are different, that are more informed. Like deep learning it's a huge architecture, hundreds of millions of parameters, as well as 100 millions of examples. So you can fit those parameters and you get good performance. But in a cognitive science, you only have, say, 40 patients, and you have to have a model that already has structure in it that you believe matches what the brain has or what the cognitive system has. And in this case, it's a map-like structure. So knowledge is on a map, which is, we know that there are maps in the visual cortex and in some other sensory cortices. So that's a principle that brain seems to be using. So we'll put that on a computational model as well. So knowledge is laid out on a map. Concepts that are similar are located nearby on the map. Words that sound similar are located nearby on the map, and you have multiple maps. And now you're already starting with a lot of principles, and therefore your fitting to the patient is a much lighter process. You already have a map that's organized to some degree, and now it's a matter of organizing the same as a person. So therefore, the technique is different. The technology is different. Your goals are different. We don't try to outperform the humans. We actually really want this model to fail the same way as humans fail. And then by identifying what causes them to fail and how we can potentially fix it, we can make progress in cognitive science. So there's this divergence, and it has perhaps been there from the origins of AI. Some people study AI as mathematics, as something platonic, something that exists without humans at all. And you can discover mathematical principles of reasoning, for instance, even probabilistic reasoning. And others look at, well, yes, but I want to understand why people behave the way they do. And there are different reasons for doing that, helping disabled people, maybe enhancing ability of people, avoiding mistakes, things like that. And it's not the goal to be perfect, but it's to be informative. So those are, I think, two-way street and two different goals.
Okay. When you consider the evolution of a human mind, I mean, it takes billions of years. Natural selection, evolution has to occur for us to get to this point. I mean, we know it takes a long time. With regards to AI and what you guys can do with machine learning, quantum computers, the future, whatever we have, the resources that we possibly have for the future, what do you think? How do you think it forms? How do you think your background in all of this information that you've learned over time within this field has changed the way you perceive how a human mind perceives the world or interacts with the environment? How do you think this has shaped and now shapes your views regarding this?
Yeah, so in the history of neuroscience and cognitive science, it's actually quite interesting to see where the theories are coming from. And they come from around the researchers. What's the technology around them at the time that they're formulating? And then it used to be that in, I don't know, 150 years ago, so when radio waves and communication through electromagnetic medium became possible, then the theories about the brain were that there are propagating waves through the cortex. And then telephones were invented and telephone exchanges came out, and people were plugging wires into different slots so that they make the connections. And now that's the metaphor that's used to understand the brain. Oh, they are actually neurons that are connected, and you form these new connections. And then we have electrodes that can record from neurons. And now we have neuron as a logical element. It's either active or it's not. And now we have fMRI, and we are looking at circuits. We're looking at reverberating circuits and networks that are units of computation. So you see that these theories don't come out of vacuum. They come from what you can see and what currently are analogs in the world. So our computational devices are like that too. So when we are building these computational models, they also become models for neuroscientists to formulate theories and understand the brain and cognition. And that's fine. But it also kind of suggests that every one of these has been wrong, right? And they've been useful. I mean, that's a famous statement that all models are wrong, but some are useful. And these are useful, but they are probably not right. We probably will have other kinds of theories and other kinds of technologies that we have to take into account. I mean, neurons communicate not just through spikes, but also other means, and we don't currently take it into account. And there are many other aspects that are not popular because we don't really understand them, and we don't have a model from which to hang them and to explain them. So I don't think in my time things have changed that much. So because we always had the computer metaphor and neurons as logical elements, or neurons as basic elements of computation. We certainly thought about other ways, but there's really it's not as easy to make progress on those more complex media. Right now, I think big potential is the spiking and spike timing and extension to synchronization that we've already actually seen for decades. We've seen some models that allow you to take advantage of synchronization, but we don't quite have an understanding what that might mean. But that is perhaps potential next step. The project of recording from the entire brain through nano devices is a way of the future, and maybe that's something that we will see, and we get a full human activation of the brain activation. We can start to formulate new theories in the future, but that's not happening just yet. So we have to make do with what we have.
But I think it is quite fascinating that like as you mentioned, we cannot escape the framework that we've grown up under. I mean, once they understood train stations and water pumps, they assume that's how the brain also worked, with sort of pump systems. The heart pumps the blood. I mean, they're always going with whatever framework we have. But it's uncanny to look at the similarities between a lot of the machinery that and a lot of the artificial intelligence robots, I would say, that we see today and ourselves. I mean, if you look at DNA and the structure and the way it's codes, it's just information. I mean, the universe, and currently that seems to be the main way of seeing things for a lot of scientists, is everything as information. And our DNA just being one of those basic forms of information that can make certain things. When you look at those similarities between the ones and zeros and the CTAG, what comes to mind for you? What do you think?
Well, at first approximation, it's actually quite similar. And we have mechanisms like evolutionary computation, which is an area where I work on quite a bit. And the idea is to capture the basic principles, mathematical principles of that kind of a space of representation and search. But we've gone a little bit different ways in that area from biology. And similarly to understanding the neuroscience and the brain, statistics and stochastic processes and probability theory has become really powerful in machine learning. So that's the kind of direction that evolutionary computation has also taken. It's taking advantage of stochastic models in order to evaluate fitness and form offspring. But if you look at biology is probably working in a little bit different way, that there's huge, big, large populations. There's only weak selection, and you can have neutral mutations, and a lot of it is based on crossover instead of mutation. So even though evolutionary computation in principle has origins from biological evolution, the mechanisms have diverged because machine learning has diverged, and you take advantage of what is there. It's possible that we should go back and look at what biology is actually taking advantage of, and trying to encode some more of those mechanisms into our systems. But we have to go where it's possible to make progress. So we know for a long time that, say, genetic regulatory networks are really important, but how do we actually fold that into our evolutionary search is not clear. So we are just doing the search and skipping that aspect. So we're making good progress in certain principles, and eventually maybe somebody comes around and points out how they interact with these other processes out in biology, and we take advantage of them at that point. So it's not really that people are ignorant of what's missing. It's more like we don't really know what to do with them just yet, and have to take these baby steps.
I mean, and that sort of ignorance, I mean, we're not saying they're ignorant, but that lack of understanding of these aspects, when you look at the way humans perceive each other, I mean, I was chatting to Professor Michael Graziano, who he has a very neuroscientific theory of consciousness. He calls it the attention schema theory. Basically, we're building these internal models of attention, and thereafter we also have to build another model to sort of try and understand what we're attending to at that point, and that's how we kind of perceive ourselves as conscious. So you can already see how the current framework of internal models has guided a lot of neuroscience theories at this point. But when you look at this mindset of understanding the mind via this computational mechanism, when you guys are setting up because my knowledge of artificial intelligence is obviously very superficial, and you can probably tell from the questions I'm asking you, but when you guys are setting up certain programs to try and compute or recreate human experiences, what do you guys determine as the basic fundamental building blocks in your computations? What is most important to you guys when you're trying to start that algorithm?
Yeah, that's actually a very hard question. In cognitive science, a lot of time you spend even more time than actually explaining what it is that you did, is to argue that what you did makes sense, that you're posing the right question and you're setting up the environment right. And if you're looking at any kind of cognitive function, visual processing, language processing, decision making, emotions, whatever it is, you have to represent the rest of the system in some kind of approximate way so that you can focus on one piece. And who's to say that the pieces that you carved out and left out aren't as important and what you actually included in your model. So that's what you have to argue a lot. And you try to, yes, that's exactly the question. You try to do it. You try to, you have maybe some hunch that these two mechanisms interact, or maybe this is the main mechanism, but it's modulated by this other mechanism, emotion, say, affects your decision making, and then those are the pieces you incorporate into your model, and everything else you either leave out or approximate in a very coarse manner, and you have to make a reasonable argument why that's possible to just focus on that. So that's why scientific progress is very difficult in cognitive science, because those kind of arguments cannot really ever be mathematical. They can be founded on human data and behavior. You can vary some variables and show that some variables matter and others don't, but you can never really say that you captured all the variables that could possibly be important. But even so, those are baby steps, and that's how you perform or make those decisions. That you do have a hunch, you do have an idea, and then you collect some data or look at some data that allows you to say that this is actually a relevant question to ask, and this is the right way to approach it, or possible way to approach it, so that you are not leaving out something that's really crucially important. And then you demonstrate that your hypothesis holds computationally. And it's a little bit unsatisfying because you know that most of the time you are capturing a quartz effect, and then the next step might be that somebody else comes around and includes more variables, and you have a more refined explanation, and you can account for more of the behavior and observations. And it's rare that something completely gets thrown out as completely wrong idea, but there's always a new model that can replace the one that you're working on and do it better. That's the nature of this field of scientific inquiry. It's a little different from, say, mathematics, where you prove a theorem and it will stay proven. And you're making sense making progress in some absolute sense. And here there's a lot more of replacement and relativity, and taking a different kind of approach that explains more and takes more into account. So that is indeed a central question: how do you decide which questions to ask, and also in a way that they serve as these stepping stones, that they are not dead ends, but they allow you to gain understanding that other people can build on. That, I think, is a really good perspective as well to take when you're deciding.
From the work you've done and from the work you've seen by colleagues or anyone else, which approaches do you think work best? For example, if, let's say, you're trying to create something that represents behavior that's similar to a human being, which aspects would you take? The visual system as one of the primary aspects, perhaps the linguistics, perhaps language, maybe just human motion. What are some of the key factors that you've noticed everybody always takes and seem to focus on, because that seems to be the consensus that probably is the spot where humans, which is most fundamental to a human being?
Yeah, so vision has always been for a long time, and still is a big focus. And part of the reason is that you can look at the visual system in the brain, and you can also look at it in animals, and you therefore have a lot more tools available to constrain the models. If you go to schizophrenia, it's a lot harder. You can't use animal models, and you have very limited population, and it's difficult to constrain that effort in other ways. But it is where a lot of these big questions are. Like in schizophrenia, something very high level breaks down your perception, your understanding of the world. You start hallucinating. You can't tell what's real, what isn't, and those are much bigger questions than, say, recognizing an object with occlusion or something, which is much more mechanical and accessible. So I don't think you should. Yeah,
I've once read that there's never been a case of schizophrenia in a blind patient. There so far has been no data on that, which is quite intriguing.
Yeah, I don't know that. That's new bit of information for me, but and that's actually, in general, it's very interesting, because you are looking at a population where you have certain assumptions, like indeed they are not blind, and Same thing with many other studies that you might consider. And yet in the human brain, a lot of the brain is devoted to vision, and even representations that are not by their nature visual, they use visual cortex. So if you're blind, your computations, your processing has to be based on somehow different kind of foundation. Maybe you reconstruct the visual world as a spatial world. It's based on sound as an input, but we don't. The theories don't necessarily cover these alternative solutions that are based on, say, different modalities. It's just so hard to do it with a normal person with a vision. So actually covering other kinds of abilities would be very much more difficult. But that's where the really powerful theories would come from. If you can demonstrate that this theory works, this model works, if your spatial representation is based on vision, as well as if it's based on auditory and tactile and other senses, I think that would be an ultimate test of whether your theory is actually plausible. And I think that we are getting there more now. There's more data available, and there's much more emphasis, and people are aware of the fact that humans are different, and we can't study just one group with certain abilities and certain ethnic backgrounds or whatever it is. But the theory is always going to be limited if you do that. So this is a new trend in science in general. It's still limited by practice, that you do have to find those subjects and patients, and it's hard. But I think there's an acknowledgement that we have to do it if you want to come up with any general theory.
And look, AI it's so diverse, and there's so many different aspects to it. But when you think about how well some of the algorithms in place in, for example, social media, marketing, understand human behavior, and they can easily use the psychology of a human being to create an algorithm that is set on gaining your attention at any point. What are your thoughts on that? What are your overall view?
Yeah, we did actually some work that touches upon that in a very surprising way. A couple of different things. The first one was in Cognizant or Sentient at the time. We've used evolutionary computation to optimize web interfaces. And it's a big industry. You try to design your web interfaces so that the users are more likely to press on a button that, I don't know, signs them up, or it's a buy button or request information. So it's called a conversion. So active conversion from a browsing user to somebody who's actually engaged with the system. So you try to optimize conversions. You try to design the site so that people are more likely to press the button. And it might seem at first that, people taking the information and they make a conscious decision, but it turns out that all kinds of things in that web design matter. What colors you use, what's your background image, what kind of language, are there contrasts, are there, all kinds of design choices matter. And people have for a long time used, perceptual psychology principles of Gestalt and other things in order to do this well. And we ran an experiment where we had evolutionary computation instead discover these designs. So you start with a space that humans design, like these are the things you can change, and these are the colors, for instance, that you can use, and so on. And then let evolution discover what works by coming up with a design, hundreds of candidates, and they are tested in the real world, seeing how often people press that button, users press that button. And what was discovered, even when the experiment was going on, the actual human designers started to calling the system the ugly widget generator, because to them, the designs looked ugly and they did not look like things that they would come up with. But the system came up with designs that performed 45% better, 45% more conversions by garish colors and active language and high contrast and things like that. And it turned out that humans did not understand, even though they were professional conversion optimizing folks, they did not understand what actually worked. And evolution discovered these new principles that are contrary to what you expect, and they work better. And this was not just a fluke. It's been done with hundreds of different websites and industries and domains and traffic patterns and everything. There are principles to be discovered that we don't know, and evolution can discover it. And that's really fascinating. That the psychology is done in a lab under certain conditions, but then when you go to the real world, people behave in all kinds of ways that you don't anticipate, but you can still discover them using AI and using this automated machine learning. So that's really interesting. Another fun story around those lines was designing AI in games so that they would look like human players. So there was a Turing test for game bots, like there's Turing test for language, that ran from 2007 to 2012. And the goal was to play Unreal Tournament like humans do, so that the human judge, who's also in the game, cannot tell them apart. And eventually it was successful. We were able to develop, and another team also, agents that were indistinguishable, in that 50% of the judgment were saying that this is a human. And also the bot was judged to be more human than half the humans who were playing the game, which is a little disappointing if you're one of those humans. But the fascinating thing was that we were trying to understand what the judges were doing and how they actually engaged the opponents and what are they looking at. And we had them play the game and make those judgments, and we recorded them, videotaped them. And then afterwards, we went back and asked them, what were they thinking? What were they doing? Why did you judge this as a bot? And they very confidently say, oh, yes, I judged this as a bot because of this, this, and this, which is really good explanation. Except when you go back to the video, you see that they did not judge him as a bot, they judged him as a human. They gave the completely opposite explanation with lots of confidence for what they actually did. Humans have no idea what they are doing.
It's confabulate everything.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you can give an explanation after the fact, and it can be completely wrong or completely different from what you just did a few minutes ago. So it is difficult to capture human behavior in these psychological theories and principles, but it doesn't mean that we couldn't still adapt to it and build AIs that work with humans, help them, and maybe, in this case, you can optimize interfaces, or you can build bots that behave like humans, even if you don't understand what humans are doing.
But that's actually exactly why I started off by asking you about this teleological next step for mind evolution, because a human mind is very fragile. I mean, we lack, our intuitive resources are very poor. We don't make the best decisions. We often confabulate when we look back at, our memories are always flawed. So in comparison, when you're looking at certain artificial intelligence, like for example with chess, and now we know that the best artificial intelligence, chess, can beat the grandmaster. It's becoming better and better. So I often think about how we're just not good enough to ever know if something had to pass the Turing test, but legitimately, not just with these poor versions that we try to. Well, obviously in that case you had 45% of people. I mean, like legitimately passing the Turing test, even if you gave this person a bunch of Ph.D. neuroscience professors to try and determine who is this machine, human or not. At that point, do you think the artificial intelligence would just be so far beyond our reach cognitively?
Well, we do beat humans in all kinds of behavior already, even recognizing objects in images. I think classifying animals and other objects, these systems can already do better than humans. And chess, yes, and checkers, you can't ever beat the artificial intelligence because it knows the whole game. Well, in checkers and chess, it's a little different because the mechanisms are so different based on search. It's a little hard to compare, and a lot depends on just having enough computing power, and eventually you have so much that humans can't keep up. But in some of these other domains, like maybe language, vision, the principles are similar, neural networks and machine learning and statistics. But again, there's a lot of power. And if you look at how many examples, say, humans have when they are learning versus how many examples deep learning systems have, they don't compare at all. I mean, they are given, the artificial systems are given much more resources to learn from, both computationally and in terms of examples. And that's not really interesting because, of course, if you just keep yanking up the compute power and examples, you will eventually do better than brains, our brains anyway. So that kind of comparison is a little difficult to say what the goal of that might be. I think an interesting question, really interesting question, is can we somehow use this technology to augment humans and allow humans to do better. I mean, that's what AI is all about, really, in the near future anyway, that we are building AI in order to help our lives, having artificial drivers so that we don't have to drive, or, search information with a bot so we don't have to do it. And it would enable us and make us more efficient and more productive. And that's what AI is being built for. And that's where the successes come from. So it's not outrageous to ask whether we could have some kind of a interface with humans, even a brain interface. We already have such things, cochlear implants, for instance.
Yes.
They are machine brain interfaces. We could have similar maybe in a visual cortex, and there have been attempts to do that as well. So what are the potential futures in that along those lines, you might ask? And that gets really interesting. Now, you can see that if you are augmenting a human who has lost something, you can bring back some of that functionality, like cochlear implants. You get a different kind of a hearing experience, but a person can learn to use it.
Yes.
And perhaps a similar in vision. But could you improve it, bring more power to it? That's a lot more difficult to see. The rest of the brain is assuming a certain kind of a function, and if that function all of a sudden has a higher bandwidth, you're drinking from a fire hose, you have to develop mechanisms, to cope with it, and whether those mechanisms would be available. And so we have drinking from a fire hose all the time in vision, for instance. We have an attention mechanism that allows us to see what's relevant. Could that happen in other information modalities as well? I don't know. That's an interesting question. The hunch is that at least right now, we couldn't really build superhumans, but it's something that somebody's going to try. And the human brain is very adaptable. It's possible that a human could adapt to having artificial limbs that are a lot stronger, or vision that's more sharper or far-reaching, or other modalities, X-rays or radio frequencies that you listen in. That kind of thing might happen, and that's interesting possibility. But we have to learn a lot more about these interfaces first, just mechanically, as well as information theoretic sense, before we can see where they will lead us. But that's an interesting direction.
Some of these interfaces, I know David Eagleman does what is known as sensory substitution. He's all his research is focused on, for example, if somebody loses their sight, they can put on a pair of glasses that has a tiny little camera on it. It sends signals down to the computer, and you wearing a vest basically reconfigures all of that into vibrations, and then you're able to see via the vibrations on your body that's telling you what your environment's kind of like, and you can learn how to interpret those vibrations and into a new experience of sight. So that's just another way of how we can easily substitute a lot of these senses. But augmenting them would be fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, there again, you have the ability and you've lost it, perhaps. And then I think that these go as far as having something looming, like a ball coming towards you. People will develop a reaction to touch, even if it's a different modality, like maybe sensory. That could easily happen, I think, possibly happen, not easily, but it would be remarkable if it did happen and does happen. But augmenting, and by augmenting, I mean going beyond, making it better. That's the difficulty, that so much in evolution has focused on building a holistic system that works together. And now you have a system that's performing beyond the parameters. And the question is, do the other parameters adapt so that you can take into account, or will it break the whole system? And you can adapt. That's a question. I don't have an answer for that.
What about trying to start at the very beginning with CRISPR, like trying to maybe alter certain genes to prepare you for some of the augmentations that you've prepared with the AI? Do you think that would actually be a great way for these two to connect?
Well, we don't understand how much about how the genes even construct the behavior, because there's, like I mentioned, there's gene regulatory networks we don't have in our models yet, and many other dimensions. So at best, we can tell that this gene is involved in something. Now, trying to modify it so that it becomes better prepared for something that's augmentation, that's still a couple of layers beyond what we can think about. But again, CRISPR could initially be used to treat diseases and genetic disorders, perhaps, that you have a problem in some of this system, and you could modify it in order to mitigate against that. And I think that is perhaps possible and a step. But we are adding yet another several levels of complexity to the problem I mentioned. So it's not anytime soon that's going to happen.
Just so regarding the human brain, and your work focuses primarily on neuroevolution. Can you just provide us with like a nice definition of what that field really encompasses?
Yes, neuroevolution means a combination of two AI techniques: neural networks, statistical machines with lots of parameters, and then evolutionary computation, which is a search mechanism with populations of individuals where you're trying to discover something you don't already know. So there are a couple of different incarnations of that. And one of them is that you are entirely evolving the entire neural network, its design, its weight values, the parameters of the network. You don't use the standard machine learning toolkit like deep learning gradient descent at all. You are using evolution instead. And the good aspect why it's useful is that you don't need the targets. You don't need labeled examples. You have, if you use deep learning, you have to have 100 million labeled examples. That's hard to come by. You may have a game playing system, a driving system, or some decision making. You don't know what the optimal actions are, what the optimal correct labels are. You can still learn by looking at this feedback and whether you are doing well or whether you're doing poorly. That much you have to have. And evolution gives that to you. I mean, in biology, individuals survive or they die. And in many domains like game playing and others, you see if you win or lose or how much. Most likely you'll have to have some kind of a simulation or a surrogate for the world, because you can't build rocket controller by exploding hundreds of rockets. You have to have a simulator that sees how your actions would affect the real rocket, and then you discover something. We did, for instance, discovery of recipes this way for growth of agriculture. And you only plant couple of hundred plants, but you have a simulator or, in our case, a surrogate model that you ask millions of times if this is a good recipe. And in particular, when neural networks are evolved, this is important because it takes so much effort to evaluate a neural network that you'd rather do it in a simulation or with some kind of a surrogate. So that's one thing. You can build these neural networks that are in a domain where there's no way to learn from labeled examples. Another one is that you're evolving different aspects of the neural network so that it becomes a better deep learning neural network. So you evolve its architecture, activation function, loss function, various aspects of design. And you might even have a goal of making it smaller so it doesn't take a week to train, or it doesn't take a supercomputer to run, but something that you put in a phone or watch. It's limited in you do as well as you can with limited resources. You could evolve a design like that. And a third reason for doing it is that you try to understand intelligence, origins of intelligence. And we have intelligent animals that have evolved, and now you can bring in evolution and of brains, and you can model evolution of brains, and you can ask questions about how did, say, herding behavior and hunting behavior and collaboration, even communication, how do they come out in evolution? And then perhaps how could we do that in an artificial domain and build general intelligence? So that's a third, that's more of a future direction, but that's also a very natural application of neuroevolution, evolution of brains in order to understand general intelligence.
So if you had to define intelligence, how would you define that though?
Well, that takes about a book to do, and you still can't agree with different definitions, but with limited resources, you can cope with the world so that you can survive, or maybe you have some other goals of creating something, but those are the aspects. There's a realistic limited resources as well as an environment that you have to cope with. You're situated, and then there's some kind of a goal that you try to achieve. So intelligence is something like that, but it's kind of difficult because then a thermostat would seem intelligent too. I mean, it is coping with an environment, and it has limited resources for sure, and it has a goal, and that's not quite satisfying. You would want to have something more than that, but it's an elusive concept, and as people have built these intelligent systems, the the goalposts have moved. So you have,
when you're setting up these models, or when you're setting these AI systems up, and you're trying to get them to behave in a certain way, is the objective then to get them to deviate from your initial direction? Is that the goal, so that you can sort of evaluate some new behaviors?
Yeah. Yes. I think this is what really drives the research and makes it fun, that you get more out than you put in. That there's some kind of a surprising finding that comes out. Like I mentioned, the hyperlearning hypothesis of schizophrenia. We did not have that in mind when we built this model, computational model, and it came out from the study anyway. And there are numerous such examples. There's actually a paper in Artificial Life journal about surprising anecdotes of evolutionary computation, where evolution discovers all these surprises in different domains. And similarly, the garish designs of widgets in web interfaces is like that. We didn't anticipate that. Or in the discovering the agricultural recipes, it turns out that basil doesn't want to sleep. It wants to see the lights on 24 hours, which is not something that the biologists thought would happen. Well, initially we turned the lights off for 6 hours, except evolution kept pushing on that boundary, and we eventually opened it up and found out that better results resulted from having the lights always on. So
do you actually test that out in reality? Do you test?
Yeah, of course. I mean, this was discovered with the surrogate model, but then you do the planting and the recipes that are the best in the surrogate and test them out, and you indeed find that you get bigger plants and they are tastier, they have more oils in them, and so on. So that's a hypothesis that burned out. And that's what you're trying to do. I mean, you set up an experiment, but you also want to set it up so a couple of things. So first, you want to set it up so that it has a chance of success. It's not like you start from, I don't know, nucleotides or something and try to evolve in that, because it's just too long ago. Too long a way to go. You want to limit it so that you have a limited search space, but you also want to make it so open that there are discoveries to be made, that you can actually build something you did not anticipate. And that's what really makes it fun, and it makes it productive. You leave some creativity for machine, and that's not always easy to do, because you have to balance those two aspects.
Yeah, I can imagine that being very difficult, because what are you leaving out? I mean, this is also still a decision you guys have to make. So I can imagine that being quite a difficult balance to find in order to get the most creativity out of it.
True, but you also don't have just one shot at it. I mean, you start with something and then you make it more complex and make progress gradually, and that's indeed is the best way to do this science in general. That your ambition, you may have a very high level vision and high ambitions, but you do start with something concrete, because it's always better to have something that's working but not quite at the level you want and make it more complex than building something huge and then pressing enter and really hoping it will work, because if it doesn't, you have no idea what's wrong. So you are looking at series of experiments and gradually gaining more knowledge, and that's really fascinating also when we're looking at cognition and neuroscience, that we tend to look at it like there's a final product and it's perfect. It's like it's optimized. No, it's in the middle of evolution. We come from a long time ago, and we're going somewhere, and we're looking at a time slice, and there are things that only make sense if you consider how you got there. Like speech organ was based on just chewing, mastication, and you started to get certain structures in speech because you had this repeating pattern. Things like that. If you don't take into account where the organs came from and what was necessary earlier, you can't really understand the present. And that also leads to theories that don't really burn out, and they are not really productive, because they are looking at something that they assume that it's perfect, and it isn't. It's actually a time point in a process. So that's good to keep in mind, and that's how we should develop these systems as well. We may have some baggage, but it's necessary because we have to discover one step at a time.
And when you guys in your own lab, when you're trying to, I know you mentioned the schizophrenia work, but what other areas are you guys trying to focus on when it comes to human behavior?
Well, right now, this aphasia modeling and breakdown of language behavior in general is a big focus, because there's been a productive direction for quite a while now, several years, and we're expanding that. So from aphasia now to dementia as well. And these are, of course, topics that affect a lot of people. So if you make any progress, it can have high impact. That's always a good motivator. Now, but also a big focus is on this evolution, computation, and neuroevolution in particular. And I think that we are getting to the point where we could address the third area of neuroevolution. We talked about these independent agents that don't have gradients, but they discover things. We talked about optimizing deep learning, but also discovering intelligence and maybe general intelligence. And I think that we are getting close to having the computational capacity to do that. And the capacity is not just doing the search on the AI, but it's in simulating the world so that there are interesting challenges to be solved, and maybe even adapting the world at the same time and having multiple niches. So we, in order to understand where intelligence comes from, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. We have to simulate the world. And that's I think we are getting close to being able to do that. So some of the work goes into understanding challenges like that, how evolution continues. Evolution doesn't just stop and start from scratch in every experiment. I mean, evolution is a continuum, and evolution doesn't have a goal either. It's happening because the environment is changing, and you have multiple niches that then periodically emerge and become a winning solution. So outlining some of those processes and understanding them so that we can then develop these intelligent agents, and perhaps there are applications in, I don't know, automated driving or visual or language or so on. But right now it's focused on those fundamentals. And I think that's really fascinating. In the next 10 years, we should gain a lot from the compute that comes available. Like deep learning became possible with 1,000,000 times more computing power. We are approaching another 1,000,000 soon. So therefore, then evolutionary optimization and its discovery could become possible in the next decade.
When you guys try to, well, in general, when you try and start off with a simulation of let's say, a single-celled organism trying to begin its journey on planet Earth 4.8 billion years ago, what generally seems to be the common features that tend to emerge from that?
Yeah, that's a little different question that we are looking at. I mean, we're looking at mostly really just simple reflex behavior on early evolution. But what we can focus on, and what's really fascinating, is this major transitions in evolution. And Stephanie Forrest and I recently wrote a kind of a position paper, a brainstorming paper about it, like what we are missing. And there are some things that we are missing that we know we are missing. That, for instance, I mentioned genetic regulatory network. In general, this encoding that is much more complex than just genome straight to phenotype. And there are some others like that, coevolution, for instance, but of multiple species. But one thing that we don't really get from biology either is this major transitions. How do they really happen? Like, how does a single-celled organism transition into a multi-celled organism?
Mm-hmm.
And then you have multiple steps in this theory of major transitions, all the way to societies with language. And there's something of a push from one level to another level of complexity, where individuals are lost and another level of individual emerges and principles. But we don't really get that great a clue from biology how that could happen. And that would be, of course, really useful, because we could computationally replicate that and come up with more complex solutions. And that means that not, for instance, it's just recognizing an object from a 2D image, you can understand the 3D world and learn to interact with it. Pushing to a different level of complexity entirely would be very useful. And I think that's a big goal for the future. And I think that we could benefit from biological insights that are not quite there yet. We don't really understand them fully enough. And hopefully we could even work with biologists to uncover them, running simulations at the same time as there's biological experiments going on, or perhaps biological analysis might uncover those.
Yeah, I mean, I think that would be a very mutually beneficial relationship, ideally trying to understand the mind with the biologist in the room to sort of give that perspective. I mean, to try and figure out from a single-celled organism what happens. Does the bacteria eventually enter the eukaryote? I mean, what's going on there exactly? How does it eventually become one? But I know you guys work. You have a company. It's called Sentient, I think.
Yeah, Sentient was acquired by Cognizant. So we have now a Cognizant AI Labs in a big company, a small research team that focuses on same kind of topics and evolutionary computation in particular. Yes.
Tell us what does the company do? What are you guys about?
Yeah, so Cognizant is a large company working on data and intelligence, data modernization, and aspects like that. But our role is to bring in modern machine learning to some of these applications, and in particular this evolutionary discovery. So there are models that people have built in industry. A lot of people have data in all kinds of industries now, and when they have data, you can build models and start to predict. So we can bring in neuroevolution and make those models better, as we discussed, and that has clear, immediate practical implications. But we also work on trustworthiness. So we try to understand when the models actually can be trusted. If it makes a suggestion that you should allocate this many dollars in this marketing channel or something like that, or make a prediction of what your revenue might be or whatever it might be, can you trust it? What are the confidence bonds around it? So we've developed some technology for doing that, and in conjunction of making these models better. But also there's a big area of optimizing decision making, and that requires, again, evolutionary models of and surrogate modeling, in that whatever your decision task is, it might be indeed allocation of marketing dollars, or it might be some kind of a design of an engine, it might be biological, it might be treatment, and as we discussed in healthcare, you have decisions to make. This kind of a patient, what kind of treatment? And therefore building surrogate models based on historical data first, and then discovering optimal treatment so that the patient requires as fast and completely as possible. That's just one example, but there's decision-making problems like that everywhere in many different industries. And that's what we're trying to do, build the technology to apply them, and the tools that allows us to do it quickly and conveniently. And turns out that still in industry, a big challenge is simply the data, that they perhaps do have the data, but it's not yet in a form that can be consumed by AI. And there's a lot of work in just collecting it, cleaning it up, making it available, and then applying these cutting edge AI techniques. But that's the goal. I mean, let's take the AI already, it's quite powerful, but taking it to the real world is another challenge. And that's what we're working on.
I can imagine a lot of the challenges also being, for a lot of people, ethical challenges. At what point do human beings want to be known better by something else than themselves? For a lot of people, that is quite a fear, because I know there are certain studies that show, like, that can tell you your sexual preference with a 95% accuracy, better than you actually can. So it's very intriguing to know that this system will know more about you than you know about yourself. How do you feel about that?
Well, it's, as we discussed earlier, the humans are not really good at understanding what they're doing. Even though they give very good explanations, they are not real. So I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I mean, you are modeling and you are making predictions of human behavior, and it could be helpful. I mean, you can help people understand how they would react to certain situations, and they can optimize their behavior that way. But all of these models that even what we are building, they are intended to help human decision makers. I mean, the better models, humans look at it and they make decisions. Now, with uncertainty metric confidence intervals, they have more information that's useful, and whether they trust the model or not, they are there to make a decision. And same thing with optimizing the decision making. We give the decision maker a set of options with confidence, and also an ability to change them and explore the world of what would happen if something else is. So one example of that was the COVID-19 intervention policies. What should different countries do at what different stages in the pandemic to keep the COVID-19 in check? And indeed, the models work quite well. They typically discovered principles about 2 to 4 weeks before they were really fully known. Like, workplaces and schools are the most important because it turns out people spend 8 hours a day indoors, and that's where the disease is most likely transmitted. It was not known at the time. I mean, people thought it was surfaces and other things, but that turned out to be the most important factor, and that still is. And these models, based on data that Oxford University collected, actually capture that. Even though people did not know it, the models understood it, and they came up with useful recommendations that could have helped the decision makers at the time as it was happening. So it can be really powerful and really helpful to have these, but eventually it will go to human decision makers, and they need to trust the models and they need to understand them. And one way to trust it is to understand the confidence interval. Another one is to explore them, change things, and see what the outcomes would be, and then convince yourself that this is the best choice. So that's what we're building, and I think it is a great opportunity that humans do not understand what they are doing, because if we can learn, even just being consistent, like for judges that were deciding how to set bail, just to be consistent across the board, across the day, would already be very helpful. There's a study on that judges are affected by it and make suboptimal decisions for factors that we don't know.
It's just before lunchtime. They're more likely to send the prisoner to jail than just after they've eaten, which is this just shows how easily we are affected by our environment, our own body itself. But that's exactly what I think. So my personal belief, it's my belief that at some point we're going to have artificial intelligence so superior that it's going to be so difficult for us to even communicate with some of it. To even understand some of its computations, I would say.
Well, that's already the case. We don't understand a lot of the computations that go on, and most people drive a car and they don't understand what goes on under the hood. And we are using electronic devices, and most people don't know much about them, and it still makes them, they're still useful. And with AI, it's quite similar, and it's going to be for a long time. We don't need to understand what the AI is doing in order to make it useful and use them. And also that AI is developed to help us. It is developed to help us make better decisions. Like I said, better predictions of the weather, and therefore we know when to hold a party garden or something. I mean, it's always going to be in that role, even when it gets more sophisticated and perhaps in some cases more opaque. But we can also develop mechanisms for the AI to justify the solutions. Confidence interval is one way. Another one is to demonstrate what alternatives would result in. And sometimes you even give really verbal explanations based on rules. In some cases, those can be brought up. So I don't think it's actually ever going to get out of where humans just throw up their hands and say, we don't know anything. We're just going to go to the beach and let AI run things. There's going to be humans always controlling these AIs and using them to their advantage. And we make the AI so that they can maximally do it. And if that requires explanation at different levels, then we'll have that explanation.
Just as a thought experiment, what would be a reaction to, let's say somebody sets up an artificial intelligence that's entire goal is to survive and to never be switched off. Do you think we'll run into ethical implications by just merely switching this artificial intelligence off?
Well, you switch things off all the time and they have some intelligence in them. It doesn't cause a problem. I think if we eventually have a definition that we started with, that there's an independent mind that's conscious, then maybe you can start to ask that question. But we are nowhere near that just yet. And by the time we get there, perhaps we have sources of power that we don't need to switch off and make decisions of where to use the energy. Maybe the device itself can make that argument for us also. I mean, we are talking about such a hypothetical situation that it's the world will be quite different before we get there. But there are ethical implications that come before that we certainly have to deal with first. And some of those are whether you make decisions based on AI's recommendation without much understanding of it, that kind of trustworthiness decisions, whether you keep humans in a loop. You can demonstrate that the world will be safer, but humans still have an ethical connection to the decisions, and just the utilitarian aspect of it. Like, yes, on average, the traffic is safer, but it doesn't help you if you're the guy who gets into the accident. So those are the ethical issues we have to deal with first. There's little doubt that we can make the world safer with AI, but we also have to constantly monitor this interaction that we are setting up, and where and what role the human decision makers play will have to be constantly changed or adapted, or at least evaluated as we go along. It would be great if we ever get to a point where the question is, can we ethically turn off the machine? We'd be done. I mean, we'd be so happy. I mean, that would be data. It would be beyond that. I'd be ecstatic to have to deal with that issue.
Yeah.
Because the issues that we do have to deal with are so much more less ambitious, but important. We have to solve first.
Anything regarding AI and where it's headed? I mean, as you get older, do you ever think, well, what are some of the things you wish you could see before it all comes to an end?
Before we get human level AI?
No, I'm saying.
Yeah, can you rephrase that? I'm not quite sure what you're asking.
What I mean is, within the AI community and all the work that's been done, that they're currently doing, and that whatever the future holds, before you leave, what do you wish to see? What are some of the
before my time is up, before I have to retire? Well, already in many experiments, you've seen a possibility of interacting with the agent that you created. And what's really fun is that when it's doing something that looks strange and you think that it's a problem, but it's actually solving it better than you can, or you came up with, or you saw. So it's coming up with something original, and that's a really interesting stage. And I would like to see that happen more routinely. Like, we would have a personal assistant, hey Google, Alexa type of thing, that actually comes up with suggestions that are surprising to you, that you don't already see. Because right now you're just asking for information, it's there, it's returning back to you. But coming up with a suggestion that's creative, that solves a problem you don't know how to solve, that would be really interesting to see. So we see that in a laboratory, but having that in a human environment, and I don't know, route planning, and managing your finances, and managing your refrigerator, or whatever it is, scheduling, design of something, spaces, or garden, your living room, things like that, that matter to people overall, but are still creative, and taking advantage of that. That would be nice to see. And I think it is possible. I mean, this is something that is within the next couple of years, because it's already there in the lab. The question is, how do you make it so robust that it would work in the world and on topics that people generally care about? I think that would be really, really nice.
Just to conclude, Risto, just with your background in both cognitive science, AI, what do you think is consciousness?
Yeah, it's not a question that I think a whole lot, because it is so hard to ever verify that you're right or wrong. But mechanistically, I mean, in terms of algorithms, it does seem to me that there's a possible model for it, and that is that we have neural networks, of course, that generate behavior, and you can trace it, and it does not look very conscious, because it's really kind of stimulus response type of very simple reactions. But it's possible that there's another level of representation, and I mentioned it earlier, the spike in neural networks and synchronization, that you might have a level of synchrony in these activations in various areas of the brain that forms a layer, which gives you awareness, at least. little hard to say consciousness, but awareness at least. Like that, if you have a representation in terms of synchrony, you are aware of these representations that happen, and then you can make decisions based on being aware of something. Now, what then makes it conscious? You have to add some kind of a sense of self, and where that might come from, I don't know. But that gives you a mechanism upon which you could build it, and maybe it comes from biology, self-preservation. So you do have a goal of individual survival, and how do you plug it in to that representation? It's still a mystery. But those are two different things. It's one, it's a level of representation that might give you the foundation for it, and then there's a need for an individual to understand itself and survive that gives you the missing piece. But how they connect, I don't know. Might be interesting research agenda for somebody in the future.
It'd be very fascinating. Well, Risto, thank you so much for joining me. I hopefully the listeners have taken one step closer to the mind-body solution from this episode. So I really appreciate your time, and thanks for joining.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. A lot of fun always, and hopefully we'll inspire some minds who can take these ideas further than we can in our time. That's always a good goal.
Thank you.
Goal.
Thanks, Risto.